So now we're going to start looking at managing collections and how you take collections of objects and use them in your views. So this is going to start out with being kind of a sandbox scenario, and our goal here is to get to the point where we can understand how collections work, and I'm talking about collections of objects, how these collections work from a controller perspective, how we gather up that collection of objects and how we prepare the view model with that collection of objects, and then when we ship it to the view, how do we handle those in the view so that we can present them in a usable way. So what I've done is I've created a set of different user accounts, and what I'd like to start off by doing is simply presenting the user information just on the screen on a page. Nothing formatted, nothing fancy, just a basic raw dump of that data onto the screen. So to do that, I'm going to set up a new controller. So I'm going to right click on controllers, choose add, and say controller. And we'll just make an empty one, and this will be my manage users controller. Now, what I'm showing you here is step by step on how to create a page to manage users, but the fundamentals that I'm showing you could be applied to managing or presenting a list of users, a list of sales orders, a list of grades, a list of courses, a whole slew of different things. Really, this is just about how do you take a collection of items or objects and present them into a page. So pay attention specifically to the flow that I utilize, not so much that I'm doing it for users, but that's just the object I'm using as the example. All right, so we're going to have our index, which for our controller, and that's where we'll start out doing our work. So as always, I like to sometimes put comments in first to think through what I'm going to do. So I'm going to capture all the users out of the database. So I will need to set up a DB context. I'll need to get all users. I'll need to move users into a view model object and then send view model collection to the view. All right, so we'll need a view model to do this. So let's start by going to solutions. We'll go under models. Under our view models folder, I'm going to right click here and say add new folder. And this will be my manage user view models. And then we'll right click on that folder and choose add class. And let's see, what do we want to call this? This will be our index view models, since we're using it for our index action. Actually, we may end up being able to reuse it, so we'll call this the manage user view model. And then if we find that we need to create separated view model classes, then we'll have to split off and create additional classes. So properties that we will need to present the user data are first name, probably show last name, email address, and username. We'll probably need to know if the user is active. We'll want to know if the user is an admin. We'll bring over the gender. And we don't want password. We don't even want to run the risk of presenting the password accidentally, but we may want to capture the date the account was created. So I've set up this view model just to capture the data that I want to present. So like I said before, I don't want to capture password because there could be a risk that there might be a security flaw somewhere in the ASP.NET framework or within our application. And if we're actually even sending that password data up to the view, there's the potential that we could end up exposing those passwords. So we don't even want to run the risk of doing that. All right, so we have our manage user view model now. So coming back to our manage user controller, I'm going to say using and WSAD DB context. And since this is a new controller, it doesn't know what my class name is yet, so I'll just keep typing. And then I will use the quick action to say add a using statement for WSAD.models.data. And that will bring in our DB context. All right, so we'll go ahead and do our brackets for our using statement. And for this particular chunk of code, we'll just need it for getting all users and then creating the view model. Now, the first thing we'll need to do is let's create a list of our manage user view model. And again, we haven't included the using statement for that namespace yet, so let's do that. and this will be collection of users. I'll just call it something very plain. So the first thing we'll need is we'll need to go to the context and get users. So we'll do context.users, and we need to get back the collection of users that is returned from the database. Now the database DB context itself is going to give us back a DB set of users. If we ever make changes to this line, things could get a little complicated. So what we're going to do is use the var keyword, and we'll call these our DB users. And what var does is that it will dynamically assign the variable type based on what you're initializing the variable to. So in this case, because users is a DB set of the user class, the compiler will take this var and change it to say DB set of users. So this var gets converted to a strongly typed variable at runtime. Different people have different opinions around the var keyword. Some people will say, well, use it everywhere. It's great. You don't have to worry about it, but everything is still strongly typed. Some people say, well, you don't know what your variables are by looking at your code. You always have to infer it from what it's being assigned from. My opinion is if it's something where you're still trying to work out your code, just trying to flush things out, I'm okay with using var. If it's something that's concrete and you know what you're dealing with, I prefer to actually put the variable, the data type for the variable right there. So in this case right now, I'm just going to use var, and then we can always come back later once we've confirmed that we're just going to work with that DB set and set it there. So for now, we'll just go with var. So now that we have our DB set of users, we can go ahead and do a for each. And I often use vars inside of for each loops just because it's easier, because that's definitely a space where things can get a little crazy. So we'll say var user DTO in DB users. And my goal here is to populate my collection of, I'm going to change this to say user VMs, user view models. And what I want to do is call collection of user VMs dot add. And then inside of here, I want to create a new manage user view model and copy my values. Now, what we've done in the past lectures is we've done these curly brackets, and then we've basically copied the values back and forth. An approach that I've started using more recently, and I found it to be very successful, and it doesn't get as cluttered here, is I will create a constructor that takes in the DTO. So what I'll actually do here is I'll pass my user DTO into manage user view model, and then we'll just simply close that out. Now that requires us to create a constructor in our class. So I'm going to generate a constructor, and if you look at the preview, what it wants to do is it wants to create a private variable called user, which is our DTO variable, and that's not really what I want it to do. Instead of generating the constructor, I'm just going to jump back into my model class, my view model class, and I'm going to create my own. So there's a snippet called CTOR, so I'll do that, double tab, and then I'm going to set, and then actually I'm going to have to make two because we'll need a blank one for initializing new objects, and that'll be used by ASP.NET when you get postback data. And then the second one we'll take in a user, and this will be our user DTO. So let's add our using statement for our DTO class. And then we'll just go through and do that same work of first name equals user DTO dot first name. And the reason why I'm doing it here is that if the DTO class changes, I don't want to have to go back and find every time I did that mapping from the DTO to the view model. I would rather have it be in one place, and then when I make changes to the DTO, I can just go back to my view model and I can update it there and know that all of my view models and DTOs are all in sync by making that change in one spot. Just as a side note, if you're curious, there is also a framework out there called AutoMapper, and it does something similar to this. It actually, you pass it into objects and it dynamically identifies the properties that have the same name, and it'll automatically copy values between them, and it has some logic to do some auto negotiating of data types. So if data types are a little off, it'll attempt to do some casting and stuff. So that's also something, if you're curious about other ways to kind of handle this mapping or migration of data, you can utilize that to facilitate that work. All right, so we have manage user view models set up. We're adding our manage user view model to our collection of user view models. And then once we've got all of that in place, we can come down here now and just simply return that collection of user view models. So that'll send that collection off to the view itself. So we're at a good spot here where we've got our controller side of our collection piece set up. We've got our process down to getting our data out of the database, putting it into a view model, and then sending it to the view. So the next step will be capturing that collection on the view side and actually presenting that information to the user.